The night echoed with the sound of a girl's cry, trembling, desperate, cutting through the roar of motorcycle engines outside the billionaire's mansion. She wasn't supposed to be there. No one from her world ever was. But when she screamed, "He's beating my mama!" the bikers froze. Behind those golden gates, a secret was unraveling, one too dark to stay hidden. The janitor's daughter had stumbled upon a truth that could destroy everything the town's richest man had built. A truth soaked in arrogance, money, and cruelty. Cameras didn't capture it. The police didn't care. But the streets would, because when the poor rise for justice, even billionaires learn fear. What happens when power meets the people who have nothing left to lose? Keep watching. The truth will break you. The sun had barely risen over the small industrial town of Casterville, yet the smell of bleach and floor polish already filled the air inside the glass towers that symbolized wealth few could imagine. Among those sterile hallways, Marla Thompson moved quietly, a janitor with tired hands and eyes that had learned to hide exhaustion. Her shift began before dawn and ended long after sunset, scrubbing the stains no one else noticed, cleaning the footprints of people who never learned her name. Her world was simple and small, but she took pride in it. Each polished floor was her silent victory against the life that had never given her much. She didn't complain, not when her back ached, not when her pay was delayed, not even when the billionaire owner of the company, Mr. Gregory Hale, passed by her as if she were invisible. Marla's daughter, Annie, knew the truth her mother tried to hide behind her calm smile. Their apartment was a cramped one-room unit on the edge of town, where the walls peeled and the electricity flickered whenever it rained. Yet to Annie, that tiny space was filled with warmth. Her mother's laughter could make even the coldest night feel safe. Marla worked at Hale Industries, a company hailed as the town's pride, the biggest employer, the sponsor of community events, the symbol of success. But beneath the gleaming surface, rumors whispered of cruelty. Workers fired for small mistakes, cleaners underpaid, and silence bought with threats. Most ignored it, believing the promise that Hale's empire was the only thing keeping their town alive. Annie often waited for her mother outside the tall gates of the company after school. She'd sit on the curb, drawing on scraps of paper, watching employees in crisp suits walk past. None of them looked at her, except for Mr. Hale's security chief, who once told her to move away from the entrance. She obeyed, not out of fear, but out of the quiet dignity her mother had taught her. But that evening, everything began to shift. Marla came home late, her uniform stained and her face pale. Annie noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she placed her lunchbox on the table. There were no words, just silence, the heavy kind that makes your stomach twist. When Annie reached for her mother's hand, Marla flinched. There was a bruise on her wrist. Annie froze. She'd seen small cuts before, from cleaning chemicals or slipping on wet floors, but this was different. Deep, dark, and shaped like fingers. Marla brushed it off with a forced smile. "Just an accident," she murmured. But Annie didn't believe her. Something about her mother's eyes told a story she was too afraid to speak. That night, as the wind rattled their window, Annie lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The walls of their home suddenly felt thinner, as if the world outside could hear her thoughts. Who could have hurt her mother? Why was she afraid to talk about it? The next morning, Marla left early. She didn't eat breakfast, didn't kiss Annie goodbye. She just said she had extra cleaning work at the Hale mansion, something about preparing for a private event. Annie tried to ignore the dread crawling in her chest, but she couldn't shake it. At school, she couldn't focus. Every sound, the bell ringing, the chatter of other kids, felt distant. Her mother's bruised wrist replayed in her mind. When classes ended, she made a decision. She would go to the mansion and make sure her mother was safe. The Hale mansion stood on a hill outside town, an enormous property hidden behind iron gates, manicured gardens, and rows of imported statues. It was a world far removed from everything Annie knew. She'd never been this close before. But she'd heard the stories, the secret parties, the screaming behind closed doors, the way workers disappeared quietly after disputes. As she approached the gates, she saw luxury cars rolling out, their tinted windows hiding the faces inside. The guards at the entrance paid her no attention. To them, she was just another kid wandering too close. She waited until they looked away, then slipped through a side path she'd seen gardeners use before. The air smelled of wet earth and expensive perfume. Through the mansion's tall windows, Annie caught glimpses of chandeliers and people dressed in black suits. And then she saw her mother, on the floor, scrubbing furiously near the stairs while Mr. Hale stood above her, shouting. Even from a distance, Annie could see the anger in his face. The way he pointed, the way Marla flinched. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Annie pressed closer to the window, her small fingers trembling against the cold glass. Hale's voice was muffled, but his movements were clear. He kicked over a bucket of water, sending it splashing across the marble floor. Marla stumbled back and Hale stepped forward, too close. His hand lifted. Annie's heart stopped. The sound that followed was soft, but sharp enough to cut through the air, a slap. Her mother didn't cry out. She just stood there, frozen, as Hale's voice grew lower, crueler. Tears burned in Annie's eyes. She wanted to run in, to scream, to stop him. But her body refused to move. She was just a child, small, powerless, invisible. Until she heard a sound behind her, the rumble of engines. She turned and saw them, a group of bikers pulling up near the side road, laughing, unaware of the mansion nearby. They looked rough, loud, alive. Something in their wild freedom made Annie think of courage, the kind her mother had lost long ago. An idea struck her like lightning. She ran toward them, her voice breaking as she screamed, "Please! Help me! He's beating my mama!" The laughter stopped. The men turned. And in that instant, Annie's world, the quiet, forgotten corner of poverty, collided with the untouchable world of power and wealth. The bikers exchanged glances, uncertain whether to believe her. But one look at her tear-streaked face was enough. Engines roared back to life, louder this time, a sound like thunder rolling toward justice. Back at the mansion, Mr. Hale had no idea that his private cruelty was about to become the town's loudest secret. What started as a child's desperate cry would soon shake the empire of a man who thought no one could touch him, and, for the first time, Marla's story, the story of every invisible worker who'd been silenced, was about to be heard. The sound of engines tore through the quiet hills of Casterville like thunder ripping the sky apart. The bikers, a crew known around town for their wild loyalty to each other, followed the little girl's trembling finger toward the mansion on the hill. None of them knew who she was, but her voice carried a kind of pain that didn't need introductions. Inside the gates, Marla's world was collapsing in silence. Hale's rage had cooled into a venomous calm, the kind that frightened her more than shouting ever could. He'd accused her of stealing a ring, a diamond piece that had gone missing from the guest lounge. She'd tried to explain that she'd found it near the stairs and set it aside for his assistant. But he hadn't listened. To him, people like her didn't deserve explanations. When she tried to leave, he grabbed her arm again, pushing her toward the wall. "You people never learn," he hissed. The sound of glass breaking echoed faintly through the hall as she stumbled, knocking over a vase that shattered at her feet. She stood there trembling, clutching her wrist, the same one already bruised from the day before. Outside, the rumble grew louder. The bikers didn't come with weapons or plans, just instinct. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his chin, looked toward the gates, then at Annie. "Stay here," he said. But Annie shook her head. "No, I'm not leaving her again." Her small voice, steady despite the fear, stirred something in him. He nodded. Moments later, the mansion's security cameras caught the first image of chaos. 6 motorcycles rolling up the driveway, engines roaring, headlights slicing through the dusk. The guards moved fast, but the bikers were faster. They didn't break the gates. They simply lifted them open when the lock snapped under the pressure of sheer steel and fury. Annie ran behind them, her small feet slipping on gravel. But she didn't stop. She didn't care about rules or fear. She only saw one thing in her mind, her mother's face, pale and trembling, the bruise dark against her skin. Inside, Hale looked up as the noise reached him. For a moment, confusion crossed his face. Then he turned toward the window, his expression twisting from irritation to alarm. The headlights of the bikes flashed across the glass like wild lightning. Marla took that moment, that one fleeting distraction, to pull free from his grip. She stumbled backward, gasping for air, tears streaming down her face. Hale spun toward her, furious, but before he could speak, the sound of shattering glass echoed from the front hall. The bikers had kicked open the side door. What followed wasn't violence, not yet. It was confrontation, the kind that stripped away power like peeling paint. Hale's expensive suit and towering mansion suddenly meant nothing in front of the raw defiance that entered his home. The men weren't there for money or trouble. They were there because a child's cry had made them remember the mothers who raised them, women who cleaned other people's messes, who swallowed humiliation to feed their kids. The leader stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "We heard there's a man here who hits women." Hale froze, his arrogance flickering behind a mask of composure. "This is private property," he snapped. "You have no right to be here." The biker didn't move. "And you had no right to touch her." Marla stood there, silent, trembling, eyes wide. She couldn't process what was happening. Strangers defending her in a house that had always belonged to her oppressor. She didn't know whether to run or cry. Annie appeared in the doorway, her school uniform dirty, her face streaked with tears. "Mama!" she shouted, running toward her. Marla dropped to her knees, pulling her daughter close, sobbing into her hair. It was the first real breath she'd taken in days, but Hale wasn't done. Men like him rarely back down, not when pride and control are all they have left. "You think you can threaten me?" He spat, stepping forward. "You have no idea who I am." The biker's gaze didn't waver. "We don't need to. We know who she is. A woman you tried to break." The tension thickened until it became airless. Every sound, the ticking clock, the dripping faucet, the low rumble of idling engines outside, built the suspense to the breaking point. And then came the phones. The bikers began recording. Every corner of the mansion, every word Hale said, every bruise on Marla's arm, all captured, all real. The billionaire's empire thrived on image, on reputation. For the first time, he understood that power could crumble faster than glass under pressure. He lunged forward, shouting, "Turn those off!" But one of the men blocked his way. The video went live, streaming straight to social media. Within minutes, the footage began spreading through the town like wildfire. People who had once bowed their heads when Hale's name was mentioned were now seeing him as he truly was, a man stripped of his illusion of greatness. Back inside, Annie clung to her mother's side as Hale tried to regain control, calling his security, his lawyers, anyone who could make this disappear. But the bikers didn't leave. They stood guard, silent, letting the truth breathe for once. Police sirens wailed in the distance, not for Hale, but summoned by his own panicked call. He believed the law would save him as it always had, but this time, the world was watching. When the officers arrived, Hale greeted them with his usual arrogance, pointing at the bikers. "Arrest them," he demanded. "They've broken into my home." But one officer, an older man who'd worked in town long enough to know Hale's kind, glanced at Marla, at Annie, then at the live stream still rolling on one biker's phone. His expression hardened. "Maybe we should hear her side first." For the first time in years, Marla spoke without fear. Her voice shook, but her words were clear. She told them about the missing ring, about the threats, about the nights she'd gone home bruised but silent because she couldn't afford to lose her job. She spoke for every worker who'd been told they were replaceable. The officer listened. The others did too. Even the bikers, rough men who'd seen fights and fire, fell quiet. Hale's confidence cracked. He shouted, denied, twisted the story, but it didn't matter anymore. The world outside was already turning against him. Screens across town glowed with his face, not the polished billionaire of business magazines, but a man exposed by the very people he'd considered beneath him. In the following hours, the mansion became a symbol. News vans gathered outside, drones circled overhead and online. Hashtags calling for justice trended faster than his PR team could react. Annie sat beside her mother on the mansion steps, watching it all unfold, the flash of cameras, the murmurs of reporters, the tension of power unraveling. She didn't understand the world's sudden attention, only that her mother was safe for the first time in a long while. But even safety came with fear. Marla knew the battle wasn't over. Men like Hale didn't surrender quietly. He had lawyers, money, and connections, the kind that could twist the story, turn victims into liars. Still, something had changed. People had seen. The bikers refused payment, refused interviews. They said only one thing before leaving: no mother should bleed alone. Then they rode off into the night, engines echoing through the hills like thunder fading into justice. Marla looked at the broken glass scattered across the floor of the mansion and realized that for the first time, she wasn't the one cleaning up someone else's mess. But she also knew Hale wouldn't let this end here. He would fight back. And when he did, the real battle, not just for her safety but for truth, would begin. Days passed, but the echoes of that night refused to fade. The mansion incident had gone viral, spreading from local news to national screens. Clips of Hale's arrogance were replayed endlessly. His sneer, his raised hand, the cold fury in his eyes. The image of Marla standing small but unbroken before him became a symbol for thousands who had suffered in silence. But with every headline that painted Hale as a monster, his fury deepened. He wasn't a man who accepted defeat, not from the poor, not from a janitor, and certainly not from a child. Behind closed doors, his lawyers and advisors crafted statements, forged documents, and twisted truths. Soon, online rumors began to surface, stories that claimed Marla had set him up, that she'd staged the incident for money. For a while, it worked. Some believed the narrative, others stayed silent, afraid of the power Hale still held. Marla's phone rang constantly. Reporters, activists, strangers offering help, and others spitting venom. Her world, once quiet and invisible, had turned into a storm she didn't know how to navigate. She stayed mostly indoors, holding Annie close, hoping it would pass. But justice rarely comes quietly. A summons arrived. Hale had filed a defamation lawsuit, accusing Marla and the bikers of fabricating the entire event to destroy his reputation. The news shattered what little peace she had left. To fight him in court meant standing again before the man who had once held her life in his hands. But to stay silent meant surrendering every truth she'd bled for. The town buzzed with divided opinions. Some still whispered that Hale had been wronged, that he was a good man who made one mistake. Others rallied behind Marla, organizing small protests outside his offices, carrying signs that read, "No one is too rich to be human." The courthouse became the new battleground. Marla arrived early, her hands trembling as she clutched Annie's small hand. The bikers stood behind her, not dressed in leather this time, but in simple clothes, quiet and watchful. Cameras flashed as Hale stepped out of his car, his confidence polished like his shoes. He smiled for the reporters, pretending calm, pretending innocence. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy. Hale's legal team lined one side, sharp suits, cold stares. Marla sat opposite, alone except for a public defender and the few friends who refused to abandon her. When the hearing began, Hale's lawyer painted her as a manipulative employee, a woman with a history of disciplinary warnings, a mother who exploited her child for sympathy. Every word felt like a knife turning deeper. Marla didn't look up. She just held Annie's hand under the table, drawing strength from the tiny fingers gripping hers. Then came Hale's turn to speak. His tone was calm, almost gentle, the kind that wins over cameras and crowds. "I have always treated my staff fairly," he said. "I'm deeply saddened that someone I helped is now trying to destroy me," the courtroom murmured. For a moment, the weight of his wealth and charisma seemed to tilt the room in his favor. Until the biker leader stood. He wasn't supposed to speak. He wasn't part of the official proceedings. But when he stepped forward, his voice cut through the tension like thunder. "You talk about fairness," he said, "but fairness doesn't leave bruises." The judge demanded order, but the room had already shifted. Hale's composure faltered. Cameras turned, and then The biker placed his phone on the evidence table. A file played, one none of the reporters had seen before. A second video. It hadn't gone viral because it had never been uploaded. Recorded from another angle that night, it captured everything. Hale's face as he struck Marla, his words, his threats. Clear, undeniable. The courtroom fell silent except for the faint sound of the playback. Marla covered her mouth. Annie buried her face in her mother's shoulder. Hale's mask shattered. He lunged toward the table, shouting, "That's illegal! That's not admissible!" But his voice cracked, not from authority but from fear. His lawyers scrambled, whispering urgently, but the damage was done. The judge leaned forward, expression cold. "Mr. Hale, would you like to explain this footage?" He tried, he stammered. He blamed editing, distortion, fabrication, but no one believed him anymore. The truth had a sound, and it filled the room. When the verdict came, it wasn't final. The hearing would continue. But the court of public opinion had already decided. Outside, crowds gathered with signs. Workers from Hale Industries began leaking their own stories. Unpaid overtime, harassment, firings. The empire began to crumble piece by piece. The next day, reporters waited outside his mansion. The gates were locked, but the silence behind them spoke volumes. Hale's investors began withdrawing, his partners cutting ties. The face that once smiled on charity billboards was now a symbol of disgrace. But for Marla, the victory wasn't sweet. It came with exhaustion, with nightmares, with the fear that Hale might still retaliate. Power doesn't vanish overnight. It mutates, hides, waits. Still, she had something she never had before. The world's attention. Annie, though, understood it differently. In her young mind, the courtroom wasn't about justice or corruption. It was about her mother finally being seen. About the world finally realizing that people like her mattered. That night, back in their small apartment, Marla sat by the window, looking out at the quiet streets. The lights flickered again, the same weak glow that had once reminded her of how small she was. But now, that flicker felt different. It felt like defiance. Annie climbed into her lap, whispering, "Mama, are we safe now?" Marla kissed her forehead. "Not yet," she said softly. But soon, the next morning, the world woke to headlines that sealed Hale's fate. Exclusive footage confirms assault allegations against billionaire Gregory Hale. Workers speak out, decades of abuse exposed. Social media exploded again. Public outrage rose higher than his walls could contain. Protesters gathered outside his offices demanding justice, not just for Marla, but for everyone he'd wronged. And in the middle of it all, a photo went viral. Marla and Annie walking hand in hand down the courthouse steps, faces tired but unbroken. The caption read, "You can silence one woman, but not the truth." That image became the spark for something larger. A movement. And while Hale hid behind his crumbling mansion, surrounded by lawyers and locked gates, the very town he once owned began to free itself from his shadow. Employees resigned in groups, files were leaked, auditors arrived. His legacy, built on fear, was turning to dust. Still, Hale wasn't finished. Late one evening, when the media frenzy reached its peak, his black car rolled silently through the back streets of Casterville. He wasn't running, not yet. He was planning. He would find a way to reclaim his image, to twist the narrative again. That's what men like him did. But as he passed by a mural painted on the wall of the town square, something stopped him. It was new, bright colors against brick. A woman kneeling with her daughter beside her. The words written above, "You can't buy dignity." For the first time, Hale looked small, powerless, because no amount of money could erase what the world had seen, what he had done. And for Marla, justice no longer felt like a courtroom or a headline. It was something quieter, something truer. The knowledge that her silence had finally broken, that her pain had found a voice loud enough to shake the walls of privilege. The fight wasn't over. But she wasn't afraid anymore. Weeks passed. The storm that began with one child's cry had reshaped the entire town. What used to be whispered behind closed doors was now painted across every street. Every screen, every soul brave enough to look at the truth. Gregory Hale, once the name that commanded fear and respect, had become a cautionary tale. His mansion, once a symbol of success, now stood behind police tape and silence. Investigators flooded his offices, seizing documents, interviewing workers who finally dared to speak. The walls of his empire, built on silence and cruelty, were collapsing faster than he could rebuild them. Marla watched it all from a distance. She didn't seek revenge anymore. Revenge required anger, and she had none left to give. What she carried now was deeper, the quiet strength of someone who had survived what should have broken her. Her days began to feel real again. She woke up without dread. She could breathe without fear. But even as she tried to move on, reminders of that night never left her. The bruise on her wrist had faded, but the memory lived in the shadows of her thoughts. A scar only she could see. One morning, she received a call from the local community center. They wanted her to speak, to share her story with young women who worked in service jobs like hers. At first she refused. She wasn't a speaker, she said. She was just a janitor. But the woman on the phone replied gently, "Maybe that's exactly why they need to hear you." And so she did. The hall was small, packed with faces that mirrored her own, tired, hopeful, quietly angry. She told them what happened, not to shock them, but to remind them that silence protects the wrong people. Her voice trembled at first, then grew steady as she spoke about the night the bikers came, the court, the fear, the aftermath. By the end, people were crying, not out of pity, but recognition. That day, a local journalist who'd followed her story approached her with an idea. "Let's start something," he said. "A foundation for workers' rights, to help others like you." It began small, a desk, a phone, a sign that read, "Hands that matter." Within months, it became a movement. Marla's story inspired workers across neighboring towns to come forward. Some shared stories of unpaid wages, others of harassment or injury. For every person who spoke up, 10 more found courage. Meanwhile, Hale's downfall grew public and irreversible. Investigations uncovered embezzlement, tax fraud, and years of labor violations. His lawyers withdrew, his board members resigned, and the government seized control of his companies. The man who once ruled with intimidation now faced criminal charges, not just for assault, but for decades of exploitation. Reporters crowded the courthouse when his trial began. But this time there were no fancy suits or confident smiles. Hale sat in silence, thinner, smaller, aged by scandal. The same cameras that once worshipped him now recorded his humiliation. Marla didn't attend the hearing. She didn't need to. The world didn't need her tears anymore. It had finally learned to cry for itself. She chose instead to be at the community center that day, folding pamphlets beside Annie. "Will they put him in jail?" Annie asked quietly. Marla looked down at her daughter's curious face. "Maybe," she said softly. "But the real prison is the truth. He'll live in that forever." Annie smiled, then handed her a flyer she'd drawn, a simple picture of a woman holding a mop with light shining around her. Beneath it, she'd written in uneven letters, "Even cleaners can change the world." Tears stung Marla's eyes. She hugged her daughter tightly, realizing that what started as fear had grown into legacy. Across town, the bikers, the men who had once lived wild and loud, found themselves transformed by that night too. They didn't see themselves as heroes, but people began to treat them that way. A local charity reached out, offering them a chance to work with youth outreach programs. They agreed, reluctantly at first, then passionately. They began mentoring troubled teens, teaching them discipline, mechanics, and above all, courage. The same courage that had made them stop that night when a little girl cried out for help. "Funny thing," the leader once said in an interview, "we used to ride to escape. Now we ride to protect." That quote went viral, and so, slowly, Casterville began to heal. The name Hale, once a curse of wealth, became a warning carved into memory. People stopped bowing to money. They began valuing truth, raw, unpolished, unbought. For Marla, life was still simple. She still woke early, still cleaned floors, but now it was her business. With community donations and support, she opened her own small cleaning company, one that paid fair wages and provided health care to women like her. She called it Bright Start Services, Every uniform carried a stitched line in small letters. No one is invisible. Annie often joined her, laughing, folding towels, wiping tables. Their bond had become unshakable, built not on survival anymore, but pride. At night, when Marla walked home through the quiet streets, she sometimes looked up at the stars and thought about how far they'd come. The girl who once hid behind glass windows now stood beneath open skies, seen, respected, free. Months later, news came in. Gregory Hale had been sentenced to 7 years in prison for assault, fraud, and labor crimes. The town cheered, not because of revenge, but because justice, for once, hadn't been bought. When reporters asked Marla for a statement, she said only this: "No one should have to scream to be believed. But if they do, I hope someone hears them." That line echoed across social media. Schools painted it on walls. Activists printed it on banners. It became a reminder that change doesn't always start with power. Sometimes it starts with pain, courage, and a single voice refusing to stay silent. Annie, now older, would often retell her mother's story to her classmates. Not the violence, but the strength, she'd say. "My mama didn't just clean floors. She cleaned the lies out of this town." And the class would fall silent. Eyes wide, hearts full, Casterville no longer belonged to men like Hale. The empty mansion had been bought by the city and turned into a shelter for women escaping abuse, named the Marla Thompson Foundation for I. Just as the first plaque on the wall bore an inscription, dedicated to the woman who proved that even whispers can bring down walls of silence. Every year, on the anniversary of the night that changed everything, the bikers would ride through town in silence, engines humming low, headlights glowing like candles. They'd stop at the foundation gates, leave flowers, and disappear into the night. No words, just respect. And inside, Marla would stand by the window, watching the lights fade, knowing the world had turned full circle. She wasn't invisible anymore. She never would be again. When you think your voice doesn't matter, remember her.